I do want to linger. I want to go back to the America First movement because he comes back to United States, tells everyone, tells Roosevelt, Secretary of War, you need to ramp up war production. You're unprepared. But then goes out on the trail and gives speeches against U.S. intervention in the war. So what is because he then becomes known for leading this America First movement, which he didn't really found, just sort of becomes the figurehead of it. So what's sort of the thought process there? Because he wants to ramp up war production, urges everyone to do so, and then advocates for non-intervention.
Yes, he gets this from his father. So his father was named Charles August Lindbergh. He was a U.S. congressman during World War One who opposed U.S. entry into World War One, and he watched his father be destroyed. First, he lost his congressional seat. Then Woodrow Wilson had him arrested under the Sedition Act, and then he dies a couple years later of a brain tumor. And he takes this philosophy of we don't get involved in European wars. He believes that we do not come to England's aid. England and France caused this war, and although they're not as evil as Nazi Germany, um, they are not blameless either. World War One is not well known. People don't talk about it very much, but um, there's a lot of reasons for it. It was a very complicated war, but a big reason was imperialism. The Bolsheviks conquered the Winter Palace of the Tsar in November of 1917, and they released all the treaties that the Russians had signed with the English and the French. And it was all about dividing up colonies in Africa and Asia. It was all about
Mm,
other people's natural resources. It was
yeah.
all these. If you were 18 years old, if you were French and 18 years old in 1914, there's a 50% chance you weren't alive in 1918.
Wow.
If you were English, it was like a 30% chance. If you were German, it was like a 40, 45. I mean, the devastation of World War One, the
Holy
number of
wow.
people that were killed for what? They were killed for some holding for the Belgian Congo, for rubber,
Yeah,
for tin.
yeah.
This is what they died for. And Lindbergh knew that. He'd been in India, and Lindbergh had been all over the world. Lindbergh was in India in 1937, and he saw the poverty and the callous nature of imperialism and the theft and the stealing of other people's resources. And he believed that we don't get involved in this, that we're not going to go rescue the British Empire. If it's going to be a German empire, it'll be a German empire. If it's a French empire, it'll be a French empire. And he was wrong. He was
Hmm,
completely wrong. That's not what the war was about. I mean, eventually the English lost their empire and they had to give India independence.
yeah.
But his father was right and he was wrong. And so he did that. He spent those 815 days uh, saying that the United States should not enter World War II. And it's not a positive assessment in the book. If you read the book, he said a lot of specious things. He said a lot of stupid things. He
Right.
said a lot of things that didn't make any sense. He said a lot of things that were German propaganda. There's no question. And the Germans didn't have a publicity arm in the United States. The English did. The English were opening people's mail. They were really very violating a lot of America's civil rights. But the Germans didn't have. So he was de facto the publicity arm of the Nazi government. He was their spokesman. He didn't
Hmm.
want to be. He didn't intend to be. He certainly didn't defend their human rights record. There's another facts for your viewers. Um, World War One ends on November 11th, 1918. The British have a embargo, a boycott of Germany, so no food can get into Germany. They've got a naval blockade.
Hmm.
They've had it during the war. They're starving the German people into submission. They didn't lift the blockade on November 11th, 1918. They don't lift the blockade till 1921. They starved the German people after the armistice had been signed. They did this because they didn't want them to argue at the Versailles Treaty. Like, if we're still starving them, then they'll agree to our terms.
Wow.
And Lindbergh knew this. I don't know the estimates. I've tried to get a good estimate on how many Germans starved to death after World War II, and it's in the hundreds of thousands
Wow.
during peace. And this is the stuff that Lindbergh knew, and this is the stuff that he blamed the English for. He said, "Why did the Nazis rise to power? Because you were starving Germans after World War One
Mm,
ended. That's why the Nazis rose to power. We're not going to come defend you now. We're not going to sacrifice our children again."
yeah. Wow, that's fascinating. I mean, even though sort of from our modern day historical perspective, we know that he was wrong, he has a lot of valid points, and British imperialism was brutal. He has very valid criticisms in that regard. Um,
And it was benign compared to the French and the Dutch and the Belgians.
yeah.
Uh,
Wow.
these countries in World War One that everybody, the Belgians, the poor Belgians in World War One. The Belgians have been raping Congo
Yeah.
for decades. I
What they
mean,
did in the Congo was barbaric.
yeah, I think 10 million Congolese died. In 10 million died, and there's no museum to them anywhere in the
Yeah.
world.
Yeah, what they would do is they had rubber quotas, so the people of Congo had to produce rubber, and if they didn't meet the quota, they'd chop off their hand. It's insane. So yeah, imperialism,
If they ran away,
wasn't exactly a nice
they just took their
business.
wives until they came back.
Yeah,
Who knows what they did to their wives while they were in captivity. I mean,
yeah,
this was Belgian, the poor Belgians of
mhm,
World War One. This is what they'd been doing
yeah,
for decades. And if you go to Belgium and you see all those lovely palaces and all those lovely, museums and
mhm,
stuff, where do you think the money came from to build that stuff? They stole it from Africa.
yeah,
And this Lindbergh was this is what he was thinking about, and when he
wow,
was opposing U.S. entry into World War II, and it wasn't relevant in terms of Nazism or the
yeah,
Japanese. It wasn't relevant, but this is where he was coming from. It wasn't anti-Semitism. It wasn't Nazi sympathy. It was hatred of the Soviet Union and abhorrence of imperialism that
yeah.
that drove him, that motivated him.
Yeah, it's easy to understand sort of his positions when you look at it through that context. But I mean, he did once Japan attacked Pearl Harbor, he did actually wanna get involved with the war.
Yes, he did. He said, "My country's at war. I will do whatever I can to help us win." President Roosevelt didn't want him anywhere near anything because he hated him.
Yeah,
Um, Henry Ford gave him a job as a test pilot. People say Lindbergh was an anti-Semite because he was friends with Henry Ford. Henry Ford gave him a job when no one would give him a job. Henry Ford was not intimidated by Franklin Roosevelt because he owned all the factories and he knew that he was going to have to make the weapons, and
mhm,
he didn't care whether Roosevelt liked Lindbergh or didn't like Lindbergh. He thought Lindbergh made a good test pilot. So the greatest aviator in American history was test flying airplanes because there was nothing else for him to do.
hmm,
And that's how we ended up testing the mask that my uncle wore in combat in that position. And then he eventually gets to go to Japan and fight the Japanese
wow. Why didn't FDR like him?
because
What's the story there?
he was his antagonist. He was his opponent. He was the only man in America who could have potentially defeated Franklin Roosevelt in an election
Mm,
if he had wanted to be president. He didn't want to be a politician. He didn't want to be in the public eye at all. But he felt he had no choice. Uh, he did not want to run for president. If he had run for president, he may have defeated Franklin. He was
yeah,
as popular as Franklin Roosevelt, and Roosevelt was a very good politician. He was a very canny politician, and he knew
yes,
he
he
knew that
was.
Lindbergh potentially represented defeat for him, and so
Yeah.
he wouldn't give Lindbergh any platform to potentially run against him.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm not really the biggest fan of FDR sort of for those reasons. He was very elitist. And I actually last weekend I went to Hyde Park and actually visited the FDR
Oh, what a
Presidential
great
Library
museum! What a
on
great museum!
President's Day. I didn't actually get to go in the house because of
Oh, that's too
ti
bad.
time constrictions, but I didn't really care all too much. I did want to see the presidential library though. But I learned this, my aunt told me this. I don't know exactly if it's true, but she's a historian, so I'm gonna assume it's true. But she said that FDR, he won 4 elections, pretty much almost 4 landslides. he never actually carried his own county that he was from because the people from his county knew him personally and knew that he was just this elitist, asshole.
I don't know if that's true. Roosevelt was a great president. The fact that he abandoned the Jews of Europe, notwithstanding,
Hmm.
the banks were failing in 1933. He kept the banking system going. You know, he the people were starving in 1933, and there was grain piling up because nobody would buy it. The price was
Yeah.
too low, and he distributed it. There was too many hogs. He killed 8 million hogs and gave the meat to people who were starving. I just like Lindbergh. I mean, yes, he was a complicated man. Yes, he did
Yeah,
some
that's
bad
true.
things. He was the president, that won the greatest war in world history. You can't. Did he make mistakes? Sure. Was he all a
Yeah.
disaster? Yeah, absolutely. But you can't say I can't say anything. But he was a great president. All of my own personal interests aside, and the truth is, my family loved him.
Uh-huh.
My grandparents loved Roosevelt. They voted for him in droves, and that's kind of a shame because they had political capital and they could have used it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, he definitely was a great president in the sense that he was the type of man we needed during the Great Depression and World War II. But in terms of his personal character and some of his political philosophical approaches to certain things, I would object to.